Welcome back to another episode of One Voice Mini Stories. I'm your host, Kevin Bradford. The entry from episode 4 ended at 9:40 p.m. with the directive. Begin tracking Next Deviation. Episode 5 starts at 9:40 p.m. At the time, I reopened the notebook and created a new section labeled Observation Window. The purpose was simple. Monitor Ellie's behavior for the next 24 hours and document any shift, however small. Patterns don't break cleanly, they fracture in increments. At 9:43 p.m. I checked the phone again. No new messages, no missed calls, no typing indicators. Ellis usually sends a follow-up text within 10 minutes after an intense call. Absence of that message was the first deviation. I logged it. At 9:46 p.m. I reviewed the previous week's communication frequency. Ellis averaged 4 messages per hour during an active conversation. And tonight, after the call, the frequency dropped to 0. That's not silence, that's strategy. He's waiting to see if I react. Ellis has a pattern of monitoring his response before adjusting his behavior. When he's unsure what I notice, he pauses. The length of the pause correlates with the level of concern. Tonight's pause was already longer than usual. At 9:51 p.m. I placed the phone face up on the table and turned the screen brightness down. This wasn't emotional distancing. It was procedural. Ellis contacted me. I need to observe the timing without anticipating it. At 9:53 p.m. I replayed the call again. This time I focused on the micro pause between his words. Ellis speaks in a consistent rhythm, 3 to 4 words, slight, breathe, 3 to 4 more. And tonight, the rhythm was disrupted twice. Both disruptions occurred when I asked direct questions. I marked those time steps, and at 9:56 p.m. I wrote a second hypothesis. He wasn't avoiding the question, he was avoiding the answer he already had. This distinction matters. Avoidance isn't always about uncertainty. Sometimes it's about preparation. At 9:58 p.m. I reviewed a highlighted message from early in the week. The one that didn't seem significant until episode 4. The message was short, 8 words, but the timing was precise. He sent it immediately after a question he didn't answer. That's a diversion tactic, not a coincidence. I added it to the deviation list. At 10:01 p.m. I checked the phone again. Still nothing. The silence was no longer passive. It was intentional. Ellis was waiting on a signal, any signal that I was unsettled. He didn't get one. 10:03 p.m. I wrote the third hypothesis. He's accessing risk, not emotional risk, informational risk. Ellis always had been more concerned with what I know than how I feel. At 10:05 p.m. I stood and walked to the kitchen. The movement wasn't necessary, but it helped reset the observation frame. When I returned at 10:07 p.m. the phone screen was still blank. At 10:08 p.m. I wrote the fourth hypothesis. He's waiting for me to reach out first. This is consistent with someone who believed they lost control of the narrative. Ellis doesn't like losing control. When he senses slipping, he retreats until he can re-enter a conversation on his terms. At 10:10 p.m. I reviewed the last 3 times Elliot went silent. Each instant followed a moment where he asked to clarify something he didn't want to clarify. The silence wasn't avoidance, it was recalibration. And tonight matched that pattern. And at 10:12 p.m. I wrote the 5th hypothesis. He's preparing a revised version of the truth. Not the real truth, the manageable truth. At 10:14 p.m. I checked the phone again, still nothing. His silence had now exceeded his longest record pause after a tense call. That made it the second deviation of the night. I logged in. At 10:15 p.m. I wrote the 6th hypothesis. He's not deciding whether to tell me something. He's deciding how much I already know. This is the core of Ellis' behavior. He doesn't operate on honesty. He operates on calculation. At 10:18 p.m., I closed the notebook. The data was consistent. The silence wasn't emotional distant. It was tactical distant. At 10:20 p.m., I said the conclusion out loud to confirm it. Ellis is adjusting his story. Not because he wants to, because he has to. At 10:22 p.m., I placed the phone face down again. The next step wasn't to confront him. It was to speculate. It was to wait for the moment he broke his own pattern. At 10:24 p.m., the phone vibrated. One message, 4 words. You still up? That was the third deviation. Not the content, the timing. Ellis never checks in at 10:24 p.m. He never sends short messages after long silences. He never reaches out after a hesitation that big. I documented it. At 10:25 p.m., I wrote the final line of entry. The story he sends next will reveal what he's protecting. Because deviations don't happen randomly. They happen when pressure reaches the surface. And tonight it did. Thank you for listening to another episode of One Voice Mini Stories.